Okay, Nostalgia Trappers, welcome to the program. My name is David Parsons, and I am ready to go if you are. In fact, I am more than ready because I really enjoyed the conversation I had with today's guest. His name is Eric Nusbaum. He's the author of an awesome new book called Stealing Home, Los Angeles, the Dodgers, and the Lives Caught in Between. I mean, some of this is deep Southern California history. The Dodgers coming to Los Angeles in the 1950s, the story of how the stadium was built, the neighborhood and the people that used to live there, how their neighborhood was essentially run over by the building of this stadium, and how complicated that story really is. This hits on some of the deepest trends that we try to hit here on Nostalgia Trap, including the contradictions inherent in capitalism and in the culture of capitalism. There's a lot going on with building this big mecca of democratic sportsmanship, Dodger Stadium in Los Angeles, at the same time expressing some of the ugliest elements of capitalism, gentrification, corruption, racism, etc. It's quite a story, and I think the way that Eric tells it is very different than this story has been told before. In other words, as he points out, it's often used to sort of tell a story of heroes and villains, black and white, a sort of cheap shots at this group or that, where the story is, when you get down to the human level, which is what Eric does in this book, you sort of bathe in all those contradictions, and it tells us a lot, and it's really, really compelling stuff. So I hope you enjoy this conversation about Dodger Stadium. And part of what we talk about in this episode is also about scholarship itself, historical scholarship. Because Eric, as he'll tell you, he's not an academic historian, but I very much think of him as a historian, and what he's done and what he's accomplished in his work is really, really valuable history that's being done outside of the academy. And more, that's what we're trying to do on Nostalgia Trap. We've been interviewing scholars in and out of the academy, I think, since 2014. But especially lately, with the acceleration in the collapse of the academic job market, particularly in the humanities, and of course we have a soft spot for historians on this show because I'm one of those people that graduated with a PhD and didn't get a job in history, and I'm sort of surviving on the outside of the academy, but still wanting to do historical work. All of that is something we're trying to highlight, voices that we're trying to bring out, because it is such a massive loss to think of all of that work, all of that scholarship not having institutional support, and not having the sort of place in society that, I know it's a nostalgia trap to say this, but that it used to, and I think more importantly for us, a place in our society that it could have. So if you're supportive of that project, please support Nostalgia Trap. Our Patreon is at patreon.com/Nostalgia Trap. We have a whole intellectual world going on there with our bonus episodes and the discussions we're having back for subscribers. And we're live every Thursday on YouTube at 1 p.m. Pacific time. Please come join us if you can, and subscribers to the Patreon get access to all that stuff as well. We really appreciate the support because we're trying to sort of highlight the really valuable work that's taking place outside of a university system that is just not willing to support this stuff for a million different reasons, and we talk about that all the time. So I hope you enjoy this conversation. Thanks so much for supporting the show, etc. Here is me speaking with Eric Nusbaum. All right, Eric, thank you so much for joining me. We have been trying to tell in the last few months the rotten history of Los Angeles on this show, and your new book tells a really, really critical part of that story. I just want to get the name of your book out before we begin. It's called Stealing Home, Los Angeles, the Dodgers, and the Lives Caught in Between. I cannot think of a more perfectly titled book, honestly, than Stealing Home. But thank you for joining us. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. The corruption and horror of LA history is a subject near and dear to my heart.
I wonder how that became because I mean, are you raised in LA? Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was raised in Ventura, California, where I am now, which is not Los Angeles, but close enough to LA to have a relationship to it. I mean, I guess everyone has a relationship to LA in their imagination, but yeah, I wonder for you, kind of how did the larger like dark history of LA enter into your life? Because I don't think I thought about it much when I was a kid.
Well, I should say I love LA. And so my appreciation for that stuff comes from a place of love.
Yeah,
But
no, I get it totally.
I mean, I think if you like engage with the city, if you engage with anything, any long-standing institution in America, you're gonna find like a seedy underbelly. That's just the world we live in. And if you don't want to see it, that's because you don't want to see it, not because it's not there. And with LA, I mean, it's really, really easy to see. There's a whole genre of art about it. Like there's detective novels and film noir and all this, you know, amazing, indelible pop culture that just comes straight from the corruption that lies at the heart of the city I love.
Mm. Yeah, it's funny that all those movies like Chinatown. I'm thinking about even Who Framed Roger Rabbit. Like it's kind of it's a common story of Los Angeles is that it's sort of this glittery, glamorous place with a dark, seedy underbelly. But yeah, it's always presented. I feel like that's part of the mystery and fun of LA, and part of what your story is telling is sort of like the political economy of that. You know that the real story of that beyond the sort of movie story. And with sports, it's like it's. I don't know if there has been a movie that's been. I know you talk about Chinatown, you think about water, you think about parts of the city that those parts of the city, but I don't know if there's been a lot of cultural work done about Dodger Stadium. I'm not sure. In other words, how well known is this story?
I think it's been covered very well in LA locally. There's been quite a few other books on it. I'm not the first one. There was a play, like a satirical play by the theater troupe Culture Clash that has run a couple of times, and it was pretty popular. There was a Ry Cooder concept album called Chavez Ravine, where he got into it. So, I mean, it's not brand new territory, but it's really, really fertile territory.
Yeah, I mentioned when I emailed you, I've done the majority of my teaching in colleges in New York City. So a lot of all of my sort of history classes were geared towards urban history on the East Coast. So coming to LA, in the last few years, coming and teaching at Emerson College in LA, all of a sudden I'm like engaged in this history in school in my classes in a way that I hadn't before. And I think I mentioned to you that I had a student that did a short documentary, and I wish I could find it. I cannot access my old email now. It's part of it sucks about being an adjunct at a million different institutions. I lose my emails. But it's this short documentary he did that was like Ken Burns style, and it blew us all away in part like because it was so well done, but also because he was telling the history of Chavez Ravine, and this history that a lot of students in the class didn't really know at all. That Dodger Stadium had been built through this really contentious process with the city and the people that lived in this neighborhood, and it felt like new information, in other words, to young people.
Yeah, and I don't think it's a deeply familiar story to most people in LA still. I think people have a vague awareness that there was some shady stuff that happened before the Dodgers moved to LA, but there's not like a universal understanding of the story and all its complexity. But that's partly because it's a really complex story and has a lot of moving parts, and it's not a very like simple good guy, bad guy narrative we might want for the movie version.
Right. Yeah, totally. I mean, it feels like stadiums. I lived in Brooklyn when they built Barclays Center over the course of the last, I don't know when that happened, over the course of the last 15 years. And the process of that, of building that was a major fight and had a lot of complicated ends to it. And I think made me aware of the intersection of like gentrification and sports in a way that I hadn't really thought about before. What were sports to you growing up? Were you a sports fan? Were you a Dodgers fan? How much of this was woven into your life growing up?
Oh yeah, I mean, it was deeply woven into my life. I was a huge baseball fan and a huge Dodger fan. So I would have said, that a big part of my identity was being a baseball fan and baseball player and a Dodger fan, going to tons of games. And I mean, it was a big part of how I related to the city too, going to games with my family, with my friends, connecting with strangers, taking pride in being a Dodger fan. And I don't think I could have written this book if I didn't have that.
Mm. Um, did you go to Dodgers games when you were young?
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. It used to be $6 to go to a Dodger game.
I remember that actually. When is that like the late 80s,
I
90s?
mean,
What are you talking about?
90s. I think when I was in high school, so early 2000s, even it was $6 to go sit in the top deck, and we used to go. That's so cheap. It's cheaper than a movie.
Is it how is that changed? Is it how much is it now? I have no idea.
Oh, it's like way more. I'm not sure exactly,
Yeah.
but it's a lot more.
Yeah, I mean Dodger Stadium to me growing up had a Dodger Stadium, and I would say the Great Western Forum because I went a lot of LA Kings games growing up during the Gretzky years, just like so many others that are drawn to like hockey during the 90s. I don't remember that phase, but either way, those stadiums really for me always felt like as a kid like I churches. They felt very like hallowed ground. I didn't really think much about the circumstances of their construction or anything like that. They felt like they were something that everybody loved, and I think that's part of one of the ironies, or I don't know, complicated things about these stadiums is because they tend to symbolize something democratic for people, if that makes sense. When the story you're telling is one that's got a lot of undemocratic things going on, to put it lightly, right?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't even say they symbolize something democratic. I would say that for a lot of people, they really are something democratic.
Yeah.
They're a place of communion. They're a place of great joy and great emotional power, and that shouldn't be discounted. And I think that that kind of status of Dodger Stadium in particular as an architectural landmark and
Hmm.
as a beloved place for millions of people gives weight to the events that preceded its construction in a way
Mm.
that it might not be that way if instead of Dodger Stadium it was, a mall.
Right. No, that makes sense. And I think I think that's why it's such a tricky thing to talk about. Because I don't know, I was when Barclays Center was being built, I remember being very much disgusted by the way it was being constructed and the pain it was creating and division it was creating in the community. And how much it was tearing down in the neighborhood. But then I witnessed Barclays Center become this place that the community sort of came around and used for a lot of different purposes in a way that sort of surprised me. It became a more beloved institution than I expected, and I think that's part of what we're talking about with Dodger Stadium. But what drew you to this story in particular? I know that when did you discover that Dodger Stadium had this particular history?
So when I was a junior in high school in my U.S. history class, we had a guest speaker named Frank Wilkinson, and Frank has now become one of the central figures in Stealing Home.
Hmm.
But at the time, he was to me just this very old man who was going to talk about McCarthyism. We had a great teacher who was teaching stuff like McCarthyism,
Hmm.
and he had been blacklisted in LA in the 50s in a really dramatic way. And it turned out that his blacklisting was all about this housing project that he was trying to develop. He was a public housing official called Elysian Park Heights. And his particular outing as a communist and the ruination of his life set the table for city leaders to cancel this project and eventually build Dodger Stadium in its place. So his narrative, his life was wrapped up in these events in a really singular way. And when he came to our classroom and told us that story, it blew me away.
Mm.
And it honestly stuck with me for years and years to the point where eventually I wrote a book about it.
I just want to make it clear this was in junior high school.
No, this is high school. High school.
Okay, high
I
school.
was
Yeah.
16 probably.
Wow. I love stories like that. I love that just like just some a random guest speaker can come and give you something that you're going to be working on years later. Your story is populated with these characters. You've got a really great website, and I would encourage listeners to go check out stealinghome.la, because you work with an artist, and I don't, maybe you can tell me a little bit about that artist, because it seems like he's important to your work in some ways. But the art on your website that sort of breaks down the different main characters of your book, really, really great art. And not only that, I think sort of indicates a little bit of what your book is about, which seems like you're focused on really telling a family story here, right? You're talking about individual characters.
Yeah. So, I mean, the book is, it's a historical book. It's a nonfiction, deeply researched, reported book, but it's, it reads, I hope, kind of like a family novel, or a city novel. It's a book about place and people in many ways, and it's a story. So instead of having photos in the book, we have really beautiful illustrations by my friend Adam Villison, who drew some of the characters. And if you pick up a hard copy or a paperback, which I think is coming out in a couple of weeks, I think it adds to the experience a lot. It feels more emotional to me than an old black and white picture. So the main characters in Stealing Home, I hate to say characters because they're real.
Yeah.
But the sort of central heartbeat of the book is this family called the Arechiga family, and in particular their matriarch, whose name was Abrana Arechiga. And she, came as a pregnant woman from this tiny town in the Zacatecas Mountains in Mexico to the Sierra Madre Mountains, the state of Zacatecas, to the copper mines of Arizona. Her first husband passed away. She remarried. They moved to LA, at a time of redlining and deep discrimination in their early 20s against Mexican and Mexican Americans. Her and her family built this life in this sort of new community called Palo Verde. And so what we think about now as Chavez Ravine is sort of a misnomer. There wasn't really ever a Chavez Ravine. There was these three communities called Palo Verde, La Loma, and Bishop. And the Arechiga family just sort of thrived. They built a house with their hands, they bought property, they had kids, and they were kind of an institution of this community, all until 1948-49, when Frank Wilkinson and the aforementioned housing department knocked on their door and told these communities that they were going to have to leave to make way for a public housing project. And the other kind of big piece of the book is the history of public housing in LA and Frank's life. And these forces collide. Ultimately, you have really well-intentioned, mainly white progressives sort of trying to tell an entrenched community how they should be living, and not really realizing the hubris that involved and how offensive that could seem to them. So the Arechiga family in particular was pretty strident in opposition to this project. They were getting lowballed by the city, and they didn't want to sell their homes for a below market value. So they didn't. And they waited it out. And then these other events happened where you have the kind of classic LA thing where real estate developers get involved and secretive billionaires, and they orchestrate an anti-housing campaign as a way to install a more business-friendly mayor, basically. And they start tying public housing really, really blatantly to communism. They start a group called the Citizens Against Socialist Housing, CASH.
Yeah. Just to be clear, this is the 1950s, right?
This is the early 50s. Yeah. Late 40s, early 50s. And I mean, these guys just demolish public support for housing. Like, they go hard. And then so Frank Wilkinson in August of 1952 is testifying at an eminent domain hearing. And he gets asked the question, what are your political affiliations? He refused to answer. His career was over right there. And pretty much public housing was over. And this project was over. So I'm just going to keep powering through this. I love it. I mean, I don't love it. The story is a dark one, but at the same time, it brings up so many really important contradictions. Because like what you're talking about is like, these well-intentioned progressives, sometimes, communist and socialist, city people are coming to these neighborhoods and ostensibly as creating public housing and creating a public good. At the same time, their efforts are
are ripping people out of their neighborhoods and gonna clash directly with a culture of people that have been there for a very long time. It seems like there's a lot of really intense, like sort of settler colonial vibes going on there. And I know that part of what your book does is goes back and looks at the longer history of LA. But let's stick with where we're at here, because at some point public housing is no longer what's going to be put there, right? And how does that happen? I know Wilkinson is Red Scared out of the picture. It's kind of it's amazing that one guy is.
I mean, it wasn't just one guy, but he was sort of the principal face of it,
Right,
he was the scapegoat, and him and his wife was a public school teacher in LA. She lost her job too. And the whole family gets ruined, basically.
Oh,
he ended up having a really fascinating second act that we can get into.
Yeah.
But, like the land was pretty much empty. So you have a new mayor in LA, this guy, Norris Polson, who's a conservative, basically like a lackey of the Chandler family, who owns the LA Times. I mean, he was hand selected by the Chandler family to run for mayor. And he has to figure out what to do with this mostly empty patch of land, because these communities had been almost entirely cleared out, except for maybe a dozen families, including the Arechiga family. So the city has this land, but they also took it with eminent domain. So they can't just like do anything with it. It's technically supposed to be used for a public purpose. And here is where we get into baseball. They decide that it would be a great spot to use to lure the Dodgers from Brooklyn. Dodgers wanted to build a stadium at the site of the current Barclays Center, actually.
That's right.
And they couldn't work it out with Robert Moses. So they came to LA, and then you have this new battle over whether or not the Dodger Stadium site that we have now is legal. The Dodgers played in the Memorial Coliseum when they first got to town while this was all sorted out. And in 1958, there was a ballot measure in LA, and it came down to a public vote of whether Dodger Stadium could be built or not. And it was a very close vote. It was 52-48. The Dodgers won. And the following year, the Arechiga family was forcibly evicted from their homes on live television by LA County sheriffs. And that's the sort of conclusion of their story, unfortunately. They didn't get the money they deserved. That was tragic. I mean, it was horrifying and tragic. A few years later, Dodger Stadium opens.
Yeah, and those images on live television. Can you talk a little bit about those? Because it seems like those images play. Those are famous images. I mean, I'd seen those, and I think they play a role in a lot of different histories and documentaries. It feels like they were. In other words, it feels like that was public knowledge, at least at the time.
I mean, it was a huge story at the time. Like, city council members in LA were getting letters in from all over the country. That it was in the New York Times. It was a national story. I mean, it was. You're talking about women and children, elderly people being thrown out of their homes, dragged out of their homes, and then sitting and watching bulldozers come in and knock them over right in front of them, and all of it on TV, all of it in the newspapers. It was the climax of a long, simmering battle between the Arechigas and the powers that be in LA, and not just the Arechigas, other stakeholders too. But it was other smarter and more thoughtful people than me have talked about it as a catalyst moment for the Chicano movement. I don't get into that in my book. It's not really my subject matter. It's not really germane to the story I was telling, but it's definitely become an iconic LA moment, and not in a good way.
Well, I mean, I guess it'd be seen as a moment of resistance in some way.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
that.
Right.
And I think that it's important to say that I view the Arechiga family in the story as kind of amazing for their agency, for their resistance, and for the fact that while legal options were being closed to them, and while they weren't being taken seriously by establishment powers, they continued to use any means necessary to get into the press, to go to the courts. They almost went to the U.S. Supreme Court. That it was a pretty remarkable act of resistance from. I mean, Abrana didn't speak English. She was semi-literate. Like the fact that she was savvy and brave enough to do all this stuff, it was incredible.
Yeah, it makes me think of other standoffs like this in American history, and I'm thinking about like the Bundy family and like being like this like kind of white libertarian family, and the sort of way that that's pitched publicly in terms of like defending their land and that sort of thing. I wonder, did this family have support? Was there a movement connected? Who was helping them do this?
So what happens is you have these really strange alliances in LA politically. They had support from white homeowners
Mm.
in LA. There's a phrase now that I've heard. I think I heard it from Gustavo Arellano the first time, LA Times columnist. He calls it rancho libertarianism, and there's this conservative streak in Mexican American culture that's very real. And the Arechiga family were lowercase c conservatives in many ways. And so one of their big allies was a city council member who represented, Eagle Rock, and which at the time was like a very kind of white, sort of folksy single family home community where
Sure.
people really related to that standoff. Like, wow, they're taking their property to build a baseball stadium. I mean, hands off of my property kind of people. And that's what the Arechiga family were in many ways. They had paid taxes. They had sent children off, or not children necessarily, but in-laws off to the war, nephews, nieces, and lost them in Europe and in Japan. And like they were a, tax-paying American family and thought that they should be treated as such, which wasn't that much to ask, in my opinion.
Mm.
But they also had the support of Ed Roybal, who was the only Mexican American member of the council. And I mean, he was walking a fine line because he was, a Democrat and a progressive, and and pretty friendly to the Dodgers, and like kind of saw the stadium as being inevitable, but also really found himself needing to defend his constituents and ensure that they were offered some dignity by a system that didn't really want to offer it.
Mm. And how did you research this family? How did you find sources? Because it seems like this angle is a really important one, but also a maybe difficult one to find good sources of information on.
It was difficult. I thought, well, when I was reading about this story over the years, and I spent years reading about this, it never left my head, from when I was 16 years old. And I always kind of thought it was strange that the story ends in many ways with this climactic event, with this standoff and this tragic eviction, but that like the Arechiga family didn't really exist to me and in these texts as fully formed people. There wasn't a lot about them, about why they were the ones who ended up in that spot. And I just became really kind of obsessed with that question, like what was it about them? And if you look at their pictures, I mean, Abrana especially had this really striking face and like sort of just look about her that it's compelling. And she was the one I was like, I want to know the story there. So, I'm more of a reporter than a historian. I'm not a historian technically. I only have a bachelor's degree, but I did the archival research. I did a lot of that, old newspapers, city files, councilmen's papers, things like that. And then I started making phone calls and Googling people and LexisNexising and all the things you can do. There's a community still of people who used to live in Palo Verde, La Loma, and Bishop, and they call themselves Los Desterrados, the uprooted. And so they have a picnic every year, COVID notwithstanding, at Elysian Park next to Dodger Stadium. I went to the picnic. It was a very slow process of like introducing myself to people, earning trust, and listening. And it's not everybody wanted to talk. Not everybody wanted to answer the phone at all. But I tried my best to be upfront and humble and appreciative.
Do you speak Spanish?
Yeah.
Yeah, I saw that you lived in Mexico City for a while, and I feel like there's a connection to the community there that seems important too. It reminds me of because I write about the Vietnam War, and writing about Vietnam veterans, for a person that's not part of that community, can be really tricky and takes a lot of trust building and that sort of thing to get people to talk. But it sounds like, I mean, this community, the Uprooted, that's incredible. So those descendants of people that were displaced by Dodger Stadium?
Yeah, I mean, not as
Wow.
just descendants. I mean, some of them are still alive. You know, it's unfortunate. Quite a few of the folks I've spoken to, you know, I got to know writing the book, have passed on since, you know, in the last 3 or 4 years, because
Mm,
you know they're in their 80s and 90s.
yeah.
But I, yeah, I mean, it's a pretty remarkable thing. You know, this community was so close knit and so organized that, you know, decades even after the evictions to make way for the public housing project, it's really like you're talking about 10 years between the destruction of the community and the construction of Dodger Stadium. Like there was a big space in between. The 50s happened, and I I was just blown away by the level of organization and the amount of pride that people still have for their community, even though that community was taken from them, you know, in the late 1940s, really.
Wow. I wonder. I mean, I don't know if you know anything about this, and I don't really either. But I remember growing up with the expansion of Disneyland, and I remember Disneyland fighting with the community as they expanded. And Disneyland was sort of like, you know, had neighborhoods all around it, and is now way bigger than I ever remember Disneyland being when we were young. I mean, the thing has like it's gigantic now. I imagine there were fights about that too.
Yeah, I would think so. I mean, Disneyland is actually sort of intertwined with the Dodger Stadium story. Like the site of Dodger Stadium is one of the sites that Walt Disney looked at as a potential location for Disneyland.
Wow.
It was too rocky and hilly for him, which makes sense. And when Walter O'Malley decided to build Dodger Stadium, and this is another kind of whole section of the book, which is sort of like the narrative and the myth of baseball, he really wanted a kind of special stadium experience, and he wanted to sort of change what it meant to be at a baseball game. And his model for the consumer experience he wanted to imitate was Disneyland. And he would send his staff to Disneyland to take tours and watch how things were done. And I think he struck up something of a relationship with Walt Disney. He actually also wanted to build a monorail in the Dodger Stadium parking lot, but that didn't
Oh
work out.
my God, that's amazing. That makes so much sense. I think that's what I was trying to get at when we started this conversation. Was that when I was a kid, going to these stadiums felt like going to Disneyland. Felt like going to a really intense and exciting place that I just wanted to spend all my time there. It meant it did mean, I mean, if I think about it as an adult, it meant things like democracy, and it meant like an urban sort of culture that I didn't really experience in the suburbs. I think all of those things were intentional, though. You know, it seems like these places were created to feel that way.
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak as much to Disneyland. I've spent a lot of time there as a parent and as a child, but
Yeah.
not as a scholar or reporter. I wouldn't even call myself a scholar, but like the way Dodger Stadium was built was very intentional. You know, there was a feeling that the stadium was supposed to make you have, and it was in that regard a huge success. It was so well executed. I mean, like it's the third oldest ballpark now, and it's still spectacular in my opinion as a building, and it's still the place people want to come to, even as it gets increasingly difficult to actually get there.
We had a conversation. I wonder if you would agree with this, because I think you're more tapped into the sports world than I am. But we had a conversation about the John Carpenter films, Escape from New York and Escape from L.A. a few months ago, and someone said, one of our guests said, well, you know, in there's a long basketball scene in Escape from L.A. and said like, well, I think that the people in LA have a very specific like love and family connection to their sports teams in a way that people in New York don't. Like they hate the Knicks. Like it's always like sort of a relationship like that. Whereas we're in LA, the Dodgers and the Lakers, and you really felt that with the Kobe thing. It feels like there's this familial connection. I don't know if that's true in other cities, but LA seems like it has that with the Dodgers and the Lakers.
I think it definitely has it. I don't know about other cities. I think the Knicks are a bad example because they're just so terrible, and like
Right.
that's not fair. But I mean, people feel it with the Yankees, I imagine,
Yeah, right.
and even maybe to some extent with the Mets. But I don't
Yeah,
know.
for sure.
But like, yeah, people in LA. I mean, the Lakers and the Dodgers are. It's it's hard to overstate how big a part of the community those teams are and how much they mean to LA.
Mm. Was that something you talk about Walter O'Malley as a figure? Is that how was he? How was he imagining that? How was he imagining creating that connection? Because that's a really interesting idea to me. That there's some I didn't understand that part of it. That there's something happening with the image of baseball.
He was a total foreigner to LA. It's worth pointing that out. Like he had spent almost no time in LA when he moved the team there, but he really wanted to build a stadium his way, and he wanted baseball to look and feel a certain way. His mission was more about changing the way we think about the spectator experience of baseball, and he wanted, a baseball only stadium at a time when teams were making and cities were building kind of multi-purpose stadiums that have all been torn down now. He wanted a democratic version of baseball. I know this sounds ridiculous considering the horrible way that Dodger Stadium actually came to be, but he really wanted to create a stadium that was welcoming to everybody, especially women who had not been particularly like sought after as a demographic amongst baseball teams in the 50s and earlier. He introduced the first everyday Spanish language broadcast on the radio of baseball. Like O'Malley had a grandiose vision for what baseball could be, and a pretty inclusive one.
That's crazy.
And
I didn't understand that
yeah,
part of it. It sounds like the era of Las Vegas when they decided to like make it family friendly and say we're going to turn this from a place that's like a bachelor swinging male sort of fantasia and turn it into a place where now women and children can hang out as well and we can triple our money maybe. I mean, what is the thought behind that with O'Malley? It seems like that's partly what is happening is he's sort of welcoming.
part of it was that he was a good.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, you cut out and I couldn't really hear what you. I thought you had stopped talking.
No, go ahead.
He was a businessman. Walter O'Malley, like he was a very, very smart businessman. He had spent a lot of time thinking about this stuff, his whole time in Brooklyn where he was a junior partner at first. And then, when he bought out Branch Rickey and became the sole owner of the Dodgers, excuse me, he was really unhappy with the stadium they had there at its field. He wanted to have big, beautiful parking lots. He wanted to have this kind of baseball utopia. And he wanted to build a legacy, really. Like he thought of Dodger Stadium as a monument to his family, and he kind of executed it amazingly. It's hard to say like what came from his personal love of baseball. I mean, I don't think he was somebody who like loved baseball the way that other owners might or other executives might. But I think he definitely saw the potential of baseball in a way that other people didn't at the time.
How popular was Dodger Stadium initially? I know that's a close vote, 52-48, but once it was built and the Dodgers started playing there, was it because it seems, I mean, to me, just growing up around LA, and it feels like Dodger Stadium always felt like an integral part of the city. Like it's hard. It's actually for me hard to imagine LA without Dodger Stadium in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I mean, it was very popular. Like the Dodgers, first of all, in the '60s were awesome. They had Sandy Koufax and Don Drysdale and Maury Wills. Like they were winning the World Series all the time. They were fun to watch. So that part of it really helped. Like the team was great. The stadium was beautiful and new. The Angels played there too for a few years. It was immensely popular, and it kind of never really stopped being popular. The Dodgers have always had really good attendance relative to the rest of the league, and it's been a couple of years dipping here and there, but for the most part, Dodger Stadium has consistently been, like you said, like a really integral part of the city and just a like successful business venue for baseball.
That's how I think of the history of the city. I mean, when Tommy Lasorda died last month, it felt like a godfather of the city had died. It felt like more. I think more people know Tommy Lasorda's name than they would know the names of LA mayors. In a lot of ways, the sports figures feel more important in LA than politicians in a lot of ways.
I think that's true. I mean, like,
Yeah.
how many people can name an LA mayor from the last, like, before,
Right.
I don't know, now? Like,
Yeah,
I, I,
right.
I can name a few because it's like what I study, but like,
Was Richard
uh,
Riordan one of them? I feel like Richard
yeah, he
Riordan
was
was. Yeah.
before Villagrosa, and I don't even know who the one was before that though. When I was a
But
kid.
yeah, I think about the history of LA, and in my head, it's like things like Magic Johnson and Steve Sachs. Like those are the names that come up in my head.
Not Sam Yorty and Tom Bradley.
Yeah, Tom Bradley definitely for sure. Yeah, that's maybe the one that stands out more than others because grew up in the 80s and 90s, and Bradley was everywhere.
And he has the airport terminal named after him. So
That's right. And I mean, I just finished watching the OJ Netflix show, and just again, like how much sports woven into the politics of the city. That story is so mind-boggling because it seems. I mean, it connects to the politics and history that you're telling in your book.
yeah, it's actually pretty easy to draw a line. It's crazy, actually.
What's that line?
I mean, I don't know. Now that I think about it, I'm not sure, but you could definitely do it. Like, in terms of the politicians who are making these choices, some of them were still around by the time the OJ stuff was happening. In terms of the white Bronco chase on the freeway and Dodger Stadium really being built at that spot because of the new construction of LA freeways, intersections right around the stadium, like it's not unconnected.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about the documentary, the OJ documentary. They talk a lot about the 1960s and LA history, and the thing that I would add to that line, that connection line, is a sort of image of OJ Simpson and USC and Los Angeles as a sort of face. You talk about Disneyland, a sort of like entertainment face of Los Angeles, and an entertainment face that OJ crossed from sports into the entertainment world, and it feels like Dodger Stadium is in part something like that, even by virtue of the fact that it's in LA and connected to Hollywood and all that.
I mean, OJ starred in the Naked Gun movies, one of which is filmed at Dodger Stadium. So there you go.
Is that the scene where he's on the wheelchair and like gets shot off the end of the stadium?
I think so. It's where he's trying to kill the Queen of England or something like that.
That's Dodger Stadium. Wow.
Dodger Stadium.
Now I want to look up all the movies that are filmed at Dodger Stadium.
There's been a lot, I think. Although I haven't actually studied it that much.
I read when I was reading reviews of your book, and your book get fantastic reviews from a number of really, really great figures. I mean, David Marinus, I don't know if people know David Marinus, but he has a blurb for your book that's really great. And I remember reading David Marinus's book. I think it's called They Marched into Sunlight, about the Vietnam War, which is just incredible journalism. But one of the things I read in that review, and I don't know if this detail is in your book, that one of these families claims that there's like an umbilical cord of a baby born in this neighborhood buried under third base. It sounds very much like the Jimmy Hoffa urban legends. Did you encounter that story?
I did not personally encounter that story. There's a lot of stuff buried down there, though. Where the stadium actually sits, I don't know that there would be an umbilical cord buried under it. But in the surrounding parking lots, there's a lot. I mean, there's an actual elementary school buried underneath the center field parking lot. No joke. The Palo Verde Elementary School, when they were building Dodger Stadium, instead of removing it, they took the roof off of it and filled it with dirt and buried it.
Oh my God.
It's really hard to like picture what those neighborhoods look like then, because so much of the land has just been like completely terraformed. Like it's a very different place now. But yeah, there's a school down there.
Yeah, the various, I don't know if you've seen this documentary, Los Angeles Plays Itself, but they talk a lot about architecture and the look of LA, and how you have to like watch movies shot in LA to actually capture what things looked like, because it's changed so much. But it's hard when you look at the area, I guess we call Chavez Ravine, even though that might not be an accurate a descriptor. Yeah, it's hard to match it to what it looks like today. You're kind of like, the Dodger Stadium is there. It seems like completely changed. Bunker Hill is another one that's like totally unrecognizable. You're like, it's like they terraformed these places. The idea of a school buried underneath the parking lot is just so haunting to me. It's just like the Dodgers have been playing on top of this place, like in the literal spaces where these families were. There's something really, I don't know, darkly poetic about it.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, that's kind of what drew me to the story in many ways.
Speaking of you writing this story, you've made two interesting comments that I wanted to follow up on during this conversation. You said, "I'm not a historian, and I'm not a scholar, and I only have a bachelor's degree." And I would quibble with all of those things because, like, what is a historian and what is a scholar? But how do you think of yourself in your work, and how did you tell me a little bit about how you got to write about stuff? Because it seems like there are different paths to doing that and different ideas of what a researcher, scholar, or historian is.
Yeah, I'll take it back. I think I am those things at least a little bit.
I
And
wondered if it was just humility.
it probably is humility or insecurity. I started off really more of as a writer and journalist, and I think being those things gave me a lot of advantages as I worked on this book and as I came to it. I've very comfortable talking to people. I have a good sense of how to do that, how to approach them, how to listen. And I guess I've done newspaper archives and stuff like that a lot, but I hadn't really spent a lot of time in historical archives before writing Stealing Home. And I definitely spoke to some friends and friends of friends who are historians, and read a lot about kind of historiography and historical research and to figure out my best practices. I also learned pretty quickly that, and I don't mean this to be dismissive of the world of academia. My wife is a PhD academic, but she would tell me that I'm right about this. I think there's a lot of academic history that gets written where it's one person writes something and then future scholars just cite that one person without checking back to see if the facts were right. And then myths get photocopied and all of a sudden they're unrecognizable. I think having the fresh eye of a journalist allowed me to look back at primary sources in a way that was really beneficial for this book. There's a lot of writing about Dodger Stadium and this story out there that is, in my opinion, really, really oversimplified in the service of some sort of political argument, various kinds, or just very much just inaccurate. Partly because people don't talk to people and they don't go back and read the old newspapers that much or read the constituent correspondence of the LA City Council or whatever it is. Yeah. And so not that I'm great at it, but I think being new at it made me insecure enough that I really did extra and it helped. I mean, I found some stuff that blew me away and that totally changed the course of the book. So I'm really grateful that I've gotten that experience and I really liked it.
All that stuff is so important. What you just said, and the idea of, what to me, what you're doing is, the area of history that I ended up in is social history, which is listening to people and telling the stories of individual lives and trying to package them next to these quote unquote established histories. And that idea, man, of having a historiography that's already set up for you and you just go there and draw from that stuff. It's so dangerous because that was what I encountered in the academy was just, here are the 6 books about the New Left and this is the story. And you can maybe find a hole in there to kind of talk a little bit about this stuff, but this stuff is the story. And it's really one of the dangers of academia. And I'm wondering about sports too, because I know that there are academics that write about sports, but I wonder how you've come to write about sports in the way that you write about them and how that fits into the larger world of sports writing, because it seems like what you're doing is something a little bit different. You're doing social history and sports history and culture. There's something unique about your work in some ways.
Yeah, well, I'm very lucky in that I've gotten the chance to write like this for publications. This isn't all I've done. I've written very ordinary and also fun and valuable profiles of athletes for Sports Illustrated and stuff like
Mm-hmm.
that. And like, to me, that's a pleasure to do. And it's a part of it. I worked at Vice for a few years, and I was lucky to have colleagues who like supported me in this kind of work and pushed me in this direction and encouraged me, and also were challenging like what sports writing, quote unquote, should be. There's plenty of great people doing that, who are looking at sports beyond just like who wins and loses. If you know where to look, it's there, but it's not on ESPN for the most part.
Yeah, I wondered about that because I mean I'm not so exposed to that part of sports culture, and it seems like because I mean I mentioned the OJ documentary. Watching the documentary, not the Cuba Gooding Jr. soap opera version, but the documentary felt like such a rich opportunity to like do history and do public history and communicate really important stuff to the kind of people that are outside of the academic world and that might be interested in hearing these stories, not necessarily packaged in an academic work. It seems like sports is like a natural place to talk about history and politics.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a perfect place for it. Sports is something universal.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, people love sports and people respond to it. They buy books about it. They, watch it. It's something that really like encompasses all the other stuff happening in society too. Sports, is a great venue to look at like labor in America. Sports
Mm-hmm.
is, we were talking about real estate and gentrification and power in communities. Sports. You talk about wealth inequality. Talk about sports. Talk about social justice and race. And I mean, the forefront of that conversation right now is happening in sports.
Yeah.
Like, this is not a coincidence, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, I think and I hope that the academic world would wake up to that. But I think that the people that are outside of it, like you, are doing more exciting work right now, and getting into it in a really sort of different way. Yeah, I mean, I think about Colin Kaepernick and Black Lives Matter and Nike and all that stuff seems like it is the forefront of our conversation. I wonder. You mentioned that something that I think is really important, which is that the LA Dodger Stadium story could be told in a very black and white, sort of good versus evil story in a way that serves various political sort of ideas. But it seems like you bring politics. Politics are in your story and a little bit, right? And like it seems like you have a political take on this stuff. I wonder how you balance that in being a sports writer, because I guess my question is how many sports writers are lefties, and how does that work in sports culture, because it seems like there's a lot of complicated elements to that.
Yeah, I mean, that's like a lot of different questions.
I know. I'm sorry.
I don't know how many sports writers are lefties. If you ask my friends, probably all of them. But like, there's a lot of sports writers who are writing with that audience in mind.
Yeah.
There's a whole world of sports writing that is progressive, and it's growing, and it's really cool. It's really vibrant. There's also sports writers who are conservative, and there's sports writers whose politics don't inform how they write as much, at least not explicitly, because they're writing about who won the game and who lost the game.
Mm.
But even then, when you're having a conversation about, whether Kurt Schilling should be in the Hall of Fame or not, after being racist and anti-Semitic and saying that all journalists should be hanged and all these things, and the question of like, does that matter? Does it affect his legacy? That's whether you're saying, even if you're saying it doesn't and it shouldn't be political, like that's obviously a political statement too. So like, you're not able to escape it. And when you write a book about politics, like I did, you can't escape politics. Like whether or not I have a stance, my stance is going to be in the book, if that makes sense. Like whether or not I'm explicit about it.
Sure.
And I didn't, write this book in the first person. I think I dropped into the first person once or twice in the book. And like my politics are germane, obviously, because I wrote the thing, but like I wanted it to be a book that had empathy for its protagonists,
Mm-hmm.
and expressed that, to me, like my political like take on the book more than anything else is just like how tragic so much of it was, and not so much making an argument, but as just like pointing out the way that, good intentioned people can do bad things, which is a big part of what happens in this book. And that good intentioned people who do bad things can also be basically consumed and destroyed by bad intentioned people.
I love that. Yeah, I love that. It's not that the story is a tragic story, but your story is not just, here's a tragedy and here's how sad it is. It's more, here's how this happens, and here's how complex this can be, and how all these things play out in more in more, I think, interesting ways than even the good and evil movie story would be.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, I think the good and evil movie story is kind of dull, and like this is a story where people are working at cross purposes, and where, it's in many ways it's more messed up than the good and evil story, because you're talking about legacies of racism and corruption. You're talking about fear mongering. You're talking about people who have good intentions and obviously that result in bad outcomes. You're talking about people with bad intentions who win, and you're talking about also the weird, messed up, beautiful part of this story, which is that like the bad guys won, and also the city loves Dodger Stadium, and it's a beloved place that is popular and great. So like, even like that, it's complicated, man.
Yeah, no, that contradiction, I think, is at the heart of your story, right? Is what is this thing, and what is how should we think about this historically? I mean, they're really great questions, and now I'm thinking about like I don't know so much about the culture of sports writing, but I think I know a little bit about the culture of the left, and I always think about, and it's the question I don't know if either one of us have an answer to, but it seems like the way the left relates to sports is something that's really been changed over the years, evolved over the years, and I am seeing a lot more left-oriented people openly talking about how much they love sports, and not only that, but sort of connecting sports to their politics, and that's something that I haven't seen for a long time. And I came of age in the 90s when, like, if you were on the left, you hated sports. That's like, sports is just like what dumb people are into or something like that. There was a very simplistic, ugly idea about sports and what they meant on the left, at least the left that I came of age in the 90s. And I don't know if that's true anymore. I don't know if that's the same culture.
I've been really rewarded since the book came out that political people, mainly on the left, but not necessarily only on the left. Like, I got a good review in Reason magazine, which was awesome.
Wicked.
And unexpected. But, like,
well, that's the housing thing, right?
But like, speaking of LA, yeah, totally. Speaking of like LA and, leftist politics, like there's a big movement in LA called No Olympics, right? It's a kind of a DSA affiliated group that is working to stop the 2028 Olympics in LA. And I feel like, people from No Olympics have picked up the book. Nithya Raman, who's a newly elected city council member, did a Stealing Home book club as part of her campaign. Like, the book was part of a progressive city council campaign in LA, and the book is like about the city council of LA in the 50s. So like, for the book to now be part of like the history in a very small way of that council is like, it's mind blowing. And that's definitely
incredible,
shows that sports
dude.
are a part of it.
Yeah, incredible. I mean, congratulations for that, because that to me is a major victory. The fact that there would be people in power reading this and thinking about this history.
Yeah, it's very surreal to me, to be honest.
Well, that's why I wanted to talk to you. I keep seeing your book pop up everywhere. I first saw it actually on the Contingent magazine book list, and started looking into it. And I thought, God, this connects exactly with the documentary that my student made, and I wanted to hear more about it. So thanks so much for talking with me. I appreciate it.
No, thanks for having me. It was a great discussion.
Okay, I think that is going to do it for Nostalgia Trap today. I want to thank my guest, Eric Nusbaum. Go get his book. It really is incredible. It's called Stealing Home: Los Angeles, the Dodgers, and the Lives Caught in Between. I think this book appeals to a wide range of people interested in sports, gentrification, housing, politics, racism, corruption, urban history. It's got it all, and it's told in a really novelistic, an intimate way. You really feel like you know these people. So thanks so much, Eric, for writing the book and coming and talking with us. Thanks so much for the people that are supporting the show on Patreon. You can do that at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. And come on by our live stream. We do that every Thursday at 1 p.m. Pacific time on YouTube. We always love talking to you. Thanks so much. We'll talk to you again soon. See ya.